Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus mini-sodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive mini-sode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm your hostess, Lori Adams Brown, and you are listening to episode 9. If you're thinking of starting a podcast, I recommend Anchor. And I also recommend starting a podcast because it's tons of fun. Anchor has been a great place for me getting started because it's free. They have creation tools that basically let you record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. They distribute it basically everywhere for you. And you've basically got all you need to make a podcast just right in one place. So go to the Anchor app or anchor.fm to get started. My guest on today's show is Christopher Kinnison. Chris is an immigration lawyer in the United States working in the state of Louisiana. He, however, was born in Thailand to U.S. citizens, and he lived in this part of Thailand that's near the Cambodian border. And so even as a child, he just regularly saw refugees who were being housed behind these barbed wire fences as a result of the civil war that was going on at the time in Cambodia. So just early memories around that, which really formed his passion. But he grew up in Thailand, lived in Bangkok for a while, and then he basically went to high school in a boarding school in Penang, Malaysia, and then came to university in the United States, studied at Auburn University, and then he moved to Cambodia and spent a couple years there teaching English at the Royal University in Phnom Penh. And he also got to work during that time at an IDP camp. And just every week during that time in Cambodia, he just had these interactions with these internally displaced peoples, and he just began to really reignite this passion he had remembered from his early years, and just seeing people in these desperate situations and wanting to help them. So he finished those couple years in Cambodia, came to the U.S., and lived in the Bay Area, where he got a master's in theological studies from Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary in Mill Valley, California. And then right after that, he moved to Baton Rouge and went to law school. And he studied immigration law. And so basically, to this day, he has been working in immigration law and just a real advocate for immigrants. You're going to get to hear just a deep dive today into what's going on in the United States around immigration law from an immigration lawyer himself. He'll talk about how in the state of Louisiana, there are just several places within the state that he gets the chance to travel across the state to meet with immigrant clients. There's several detention centers throughout middle and northern Louisiana that he's involved with. And then he also has served as an adjunct professor of immigration law at a local university there in Baton Rouge. Chris, he speaks Thai, he speaks Khmer from his time in Cambodia, a little bit of Spanish. He is just very much a third culture kid in every way. And you're just going to see how, along with so many TCKs or third culture kids, he's spending his life to make a difference in the lives of others, which is pretty typical of those of us who've grown up in those experiences. So it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce my friend Chris Kinnison to you today. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, Lori, can you hear me?
Hey, I can. Great to hear your
Excellent.
voice.
Yes, you too. It's been
Thanks.
a few years, huh?
I know it has been several years. I feel like I see your sister all the time, at least on Zoom these days.
That's funny. I feel like it's
Yeah,
probably been at least 5 or 6 since we've seen you guys. Probably longer than that, maybe
it
even
may have
10.
been.
So,
Yeah, thanks for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. I think people are going to be,
absolutely.
yeah, I think you have a special um, role in this whole area of immigration. So I was really glad that you had the time to talk today about it. I just wanted to start off with you letting yourself give your own introduction, because I know you've been, an advocate for immigrants in the U.S. and even globally. So, yeah, just describe kind of what your role is, who you are, and what you do.
So, my name is Christopher Kinnison. I am an immigration attorney. I live in central Louisiana. I've been practicing law for 10 years. Well, really for all 10 years, I've been doing immigration. I focused in some other areas a lot my first few years, but the last 5 or 6, I've almost been doing exclusively immigration law. Um, so in central Louisiana, most people don't think of it as really like who lives there, what kind of immigrants live in central Louisiana. But a lot of there are actually like around 10 different ICE detention centers that are located
Wow.
within about 2 hours of me.
Okay.
So most people don't know ICE. Most of the detention centers aren't, in fact, near big cities like New York or Miami or Chicago. Most of the detention centers they operate are in extremely rural areas, and they're operated by private contractors or sheriff's offices. And it's just mainly because it's so much cheaper to run a detention center in a rural area than it is in a more populated area.
Yeah, it makes
Um,
sense.
a big challenge with that, though, comes in there's very little access to representation for these immigrants who are, stuck in the middle of nowhere. So
Yeah.
there aren't a whole lot of attorneys that do this work. And so for me, most of my work, I call my car is my office because I'm pretty much, driving most every week, like 3 to 4 days a week on the road. And so I live in Alexandria and that I'm only, again, there's detention centers in Shreveport, Monroe, Natchez, Mississippi, a bunch of smaller towns. And so that's mostly what I do. A large portion of my clients are asylum seekers. They've come
Okay.
from all over the world, from Syria, from Eritrea, from, Central America, Cameroon, all over the place, Venezuela, all over the place, seeking asylum in the U.S. And so a large part of what I do is representing them in their asylum case.
Yeah, that's so great. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on a lot of these things because you're certainly on the front lines getting to know immigrants and the whole process especially with the asylum cases. How would you describe, like in your own words, what's kind of going on, at least in the US, with immigration?
I think restrictive would be the word that comes to my mind. I think that the current administration, it seems like every 2 or 3 months, some new rule comes out limiting or making it more difficult to enter the United States.
Yeah.
Always a new set of rules that make it, especially when it comes to asylum seekers.
Yeah.
We have our country is a signatory to a lot of international treaties, and on those treaties, we're required to, give asylum seekers the chance to seek asylum to prove their case. And all of them, until the last several years, the process has generally been they come to the United States, they seek asylum, they tell the Customs and Border Patrol officers they want to request asylum. Then they're given it's called a credible fear interview. If they pass the interview and they have a credible fear of returning to their country, then they will be allowed to apply for asylum. But in the past, Most of them were paroled, which would mean they would ultimately release them, allow to a U.S. sponsor and allow them to live in the U.S. But the ICE doesn't parole people anymore. And so what you see now is most of the people of seeking asylum are all detained. Um, and not only, so that's another, but like for another example is the Migrant Protection Protocol, the MPP. Basically, what the U.S. is doing now is forcing the migrants seeking asylum to stay in Mexico before while their case is pending, and then they'll enter the U.S. for the sole purpose of having their hearing, their final trial. I'm not personally involved in those cases because those are more Texas border cases like El Paso. So more of the attorneys
Yeah.
on the border of Texas and in Mexico, they handle those cases, but those cases don't come to Louisiana. But so that's just another example. Another rule that the administration issued that if you're an asylum seeker and you pass through a third country to come to the U.S., then you don't qualify for asylum. So the reality is, no asylum seekers, they're not going to get a visa to the U.S. They're not going to just be able to fly into the Dallas airport and request asylum.
Yeah.
We won't. They won't let them even board the plane unless they have a visa, and the U.S. isn't issuing a
Wow.
visa. So, for example, someone that wants to come, so Cameroon is a kind of a hot topic these days because it's almost a civil war between the Anglophones and the Francophones. And so that's a good example. So someone from Cameroon that wants to, that's being have an arrest warrant issued against them, they want to flee and come to the U.S., they're going to have to go through Central America before they can even arrive in the United States. And those
Yeah.
people, if they enter through Mexico, then the U.S. is going to say, I'm sorry, you entered through a third country. You're not eligible for asylum. Fortunately for that rule, it was struck down just about a month or two ago by a federal court. But, again,
Awesome.
these are just things that, every 3 or 4 months, things get tighter and tighter and tighter. And until most recently with the COVID, the U.S. isn't even allowing asylum seekers in at all. There's a complete blockage.
Yeah.
And so there's very few people left in the detention center. There's still a few cases, but I mean, what is the saying? Don't let a good tragedy go
Wasted.
wasted. And I think the current administration has taken that to its 100% capacity, using COVID to try to as an excuse to like limit people's entrance into the United States.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking because, I mean, I know just even for the Venezuelan asylum seekers, which I think is a pretty large number for what I understand, and having grown up there and have friends there, and a lot of my friends over the years during some really difficult times, kind of in the latter years of Hugo Chavez and then increasingly under Nicolas Maduro and his rule, have gone to other countries. I know the U.S. has been a big recipient, but other countries in South America have received them. But in cases where they did need to seek asylum in the U.S. if they're coming from Peru, for example, or if they've gone to Spain or somewhere else first, then they wouldn't be eligible.
Right.
But I just feel like they add so much to our culture. Like, I mean, on the good side is those who have gotten in have opened Venezuelan restaurants, which used to be really scarce when I was back in getting my master's degree in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
But then now they're everywhere because the asylum seekers, when they come, they tend to bring their food and their culture with them, and they open up delicious restaurants, and then there becomes a community. And they've definitely, in my perspective, enriched our culture in the U.S., quite a bit. So it is sad that we've kind of shut that part
Yeah,
down.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I think that there's this view of immigrants that they are a burden to society, but I've never seen that. So many immigrants are
Yeah.
hardworking individuals. They want to make a life for themselves. They want to work hard and they want to contribute. And it's the identity of our nation. Like we are a nation of immigrants, and we still are,
Yeah.
despite the last 3 years. I believe that that's ultimately we are in our being and our identity. And so it's sad as someone who, didn't live permanently in the U.S. until I was, an adult, to see the backlash against immigrants that we've seen in the last, several years. It's tough to see that.
It is tough to see that. So I would love for our audience just to hear more about the way that you grew up, because I know that you grew up in Bangkok, and then you also went to high school, at least for part of it, and boarding school in Penang, Malaysia, and then you also lived as an adult for a period of time in Cambodia. So I'd just be interested about your own experience, living on an immigrant visa in other countries for most of your life, and, how you were received in that regard, and how that gives you a perspective on immigration.
So yeah, I was born in Thailand in 1978. When I was a small child, I grew up on the eastern side of Thailand, near only within like an hour of Cambodia. So I grew up, seeing the UNHCR camps for the people fleeing Cambodia, in the barbed wire fences and those blue tarp roofs. So I
Yeah.
have like very vivid memories as a child of like always seeing those people. And they were obviously at that point they had escaped the Khmer Rouge and they were out of danger, but life was still really tough for them. So I had such vivid memories as a child seeing people in desperate circumstances. And then I was always
Yeah.
so extremely curious about Cambodia. Before that, in high school, I went to boarding school in Malaysia, which is Penang, which is this amazing island,
Yeah.
south of Thailand. And you've been there. It's like a lot of people go there for tourism. My school was literally on the
Yeah.
beach. And so I remember
I know, it's so
I remember
great.
walking to class and you could see porpoises like swimming like 20 feet offshore. It was an amazing life.
It's ridiculous.
I loved it. Uh, and so then I went back to the U.S., went to college at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. But I always had this desire to go to Cambodia and experience it. And so for 2 years after college, I did a couple of things. I taught English at a university, but I also worked at an internal displacement camp. Like a few months before I arrived, some of the slums are burned down in the capital, Phnom Penh. And so the government basically shipped all like thousands of people to this like 20 kilometers outside the capital to this kind of barren wasteland. It actually right near I'm not sure if you've been to Phnom Penh, but it's near the killing fields, Chung Ek. If you've ever been out to the killing fields, you would know that there's just nothing there. The soil is terrible. You can't grow crops. And so these people, there's dirty water. I mean, it was just awful conditions. And so my organization basically worked and we built dikes and wells and we brought clean food. We took them to the hospital. We did all that. And I wasn't the main person that, but I volunteered a couple days a week and I would drive out there on all these potholes on my little moto, with like 100cc motorcycle. Um, and we just, I didn't have many skills back then. So we just do what we could to try to help. I probably was more of a burden than a help, but I loved it. So that's really kind of where my passion for helping people in desperate situations probably, I would say, took hold for me. When I left Cambodia, I absolutely knew that doing like human rights work was my passion. That was what God designed for me to do. And so I think my goal from that point was to figure out some way to do that work. And I thought going to law school would be a good way to do it. Although I never ever intended to actually be a practicing attorney. It was always my goal to go to law school, get my degree, then move to like Africa and do human rights work in Africa. That was my dream. But when I graduated in 2010, as most people remember, there's the economic recession because of the housing market crash, and
Yeah.
basically nonprofits weren't even hiring anymore at that point. Law firms weren't even hiring. I think I applied to over 100 law firms in my last year of law school, and I think I got one job offer. So my options were limited. So I didn't go to Africa like I dreamed of. I ended up just doing like insurance defense, and that was awful. Car wrecks, that was the worst thing ever. So I was really close to just leaving, quitting altogether. But, fortunately, I had a few clients that were immigrants and a couple of these detention centers. And I honestly, when I went to law school last year, I didn't realize the opportunity that was here in central Louisiana. But I love it. It's absolutely what, having the ability to look back on the last 10 years of my life as an attorney. I have been able to help a lot of people in really desperate circumstances. And I have, that's one thing that we don't realize. When you go overseas, you don't really have the tools to really help people. You don't know the language, you don't
Yeah.
know their culture. It's really tough helping someone else when you're outside of your own element. But for me,
Yeah.
living in the U.S. And having the legal background knowledge of the asylum rules and process, I am able to use a very specific skill set to help people who are who've been persecuted, who've been tortured, who've been, imprisoned. I have one of my first clients, I won't forget this, and I kind of did this on a pro bono case. I had a doctor from Syria. He was a part of the opposition. He, during the Syrian war back in the, after the Arab Spring, most people probably have some background information about it, but he was, part of the opposition. He was a physician. And so he was doing this mobile medical clinic. You couldn't treat people in the hospitals because if you treated the protesters in the hospitals, the government would go in and arrest you. So they basically had these, they would go to people's homes and treat people like gunshot wounds. And so he finally was caught by the regime, by the Assad regime, and he was, electric shock torture. He still has scars on his body from it. I think the sad thing, despite all his suffering, he volunteered with Doctors Without Borders. Despite all his suffering, he came to the U.S., he sought asylum, and guess what happens? He's detained for 3 months. He's literally in a U.S. prison for 3 months before they released him. And it goes to show you it's hard to believe that someone that's been through all that in life, that we would put them through, 3 months of basically, and, these detention centers are prisons. They're often used as prisons. So that, people say it's not, these aren't criminal prisons, but they're the exact same facilities that we use for state prisoners are used for immigrants. So there's no difference between a detention center for immigrants and a prison for criminals that are convicted of very serious crimes. And so what do we do in America? We take people who have suffered, and we keep them detained for as long as they can possibly keep them detained for, only further and prolonging the suffering that they've already faced. But the good news for this doctor, we won his case. He has had an immigration judge in Houston, Texas, and we won his case, and he's free now. He's about to become a permanent resident. He went to medical school in epidemiology in New York, and he actually was he volunteered to fight COVID. He got COVID himself, got really, really sick. I guess that's such a good example, like his life. Like if we allow immigrants, he loves America. The things that he's done for our society because the immigration judge had compassion on him, and the judge granted him his asylum case. And now look, he's making an incredible difference for the community that he's living with in New York City. So that's a really good example. That's why I do what I do, to empower others to do what they do. And being able to play a small role in his life, means a lot. And we still keep up with each other. My job is personal to me. It's not an 8 to 5 job. My clients text me in the middle of the night. They call me on Saturday mornings or Sunday evenings. But I enjoy it. That's who I'm, that's what I do. And I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, you definitely bring brain and heart to this scenario. And I'm just glad there are immigration lawyers like you out there. I'm sure there are others that are, we could interview that are just the same, because I know that there are people out there, in the United States right now, just trying their best to go against what seems to be, shutting out victims of violence and governments that are oppressive of people. And like you said, America has always been a place for people to come to and, try to restart. And I just think that, from the immigrants I've known and the immigrants I hear people talk about that work with immigrants here that I know, I just don't really hear the stories that we're seeing in some of the, negative rhetoric from some of the higher levels of our government. So I would love for you to speak about, what are some of the misconceptions that you think people might have, especially in the United States, but even other countries around the world that are facing these kind of lockdowns against, immigrants? What are some of the misconceptions that you would like to clear up about immigrants?
I think there's two big ones. I think I kind of discussed this kind of briefly earlier. I think that the idea that they're a burden to our society. I don't do a lot of this as much as I do to immigrants, but I help some farmers. I have some clients who are farmers. They try to get these agriculture visas, these H-2A visas to bring people in. And these farmers, they tell me, man, without these immigrants coming in from Mexico or from other countries in Central America doing this work, the hard labor, like, planting and harvesting and, the kind of labor that you have to bend down and get on your knees like 10 hours a day. It's
Yeah.
brutal work. And without these
Hmm.
immigrants doing the work, they wouldn't be able to survive because the U.S. citizens absolutely would. You literally can't find enough U.S. citizens that are willing to do that work. Um, so
Yeah.
without immigrants, legal and illegal, they formed. They're such. I think they're the backbone of who we are as a country. The hardworking people that either spend 12 hours a day, in the fields or in, factories or, operating their own, shops like your Venezuelan friends, that's critical to our economy. And
Yeah.
I can't imagine if you were to expel, what is it, 20 million? I can't remember the exact number
Yeah.
of illegal immigrants in our nation. Everything it'd fall, it would crash, it wouldn't get better. And so I
Yeah.
think that's the number one thing. But another thing that really, this is like, huge pet peeve of mine, is this notion that they're dangerous. I think
Yeah.
there have been a lot of studies on this showing that, immigrants aren't any more like there's no increased danger. Anytime an illegal immigrant, has a car accident or a DUI and kills someone, it makes national news like, oh, this person, if we would have heightened our, security, then this never would have happened. This U.S. citizen never would have died. And it's a sad story, but the reality is when you look at all the immigrants combined, legal and illegal, our country is not a more dangerous place because of them, at all. So those are probably in my work I've done with immigrants over the last 10 years, probably, another is they don't pay taxes, but a lot of them do. Even a lot of illegal immigrants will pay taxes, um, you
Yeah.
know, and so there's so many. But I think the big one I think that I would love for, it's just the idea of a burden. They're not a burden. They contribute in so many ways to not only our culture, but to our economy as well. I think that we are a better nation because of them.
I agree. And I think, for both you and I having a US passport, but being raised overseas and living overseas for so many years and being so welcomed as an immigrant in other places, being on immigrant visas of various kinds, it's not that we never did anything wrong, right? But that
Right.
it wouldn't make the news if we did. I mean, we had a car accident at one point, and it was like, it just, things happen, right? But
Right.
nobody made a big deal like, kick out all the people with a US passport from this country because there was a car accident today with, like, we've
Right.
just never been treated like that. I'm sure
Hmm.
there are places around the world where that might have happened, but it's pretty shameful and embarrassing the way the story gets so flipped in the other direction. And I totally agree with you.
I think,
I'd love for you to also
as a
go
U.S.
ahead.
citizen living abroad, I don't think there's any way for me to possibly it's, well, there's some ways, but it's really difficult because it's such a different experience, right? It goes back to what you said.
Yeah.
We weren't treated as bothersome, like at least I wasn't in Thailand and Cambodia and Malaysia. I was never treated
Yeah.
as a burden to them.
Yeah.
I've always was accepted wherever I went, and appreciated. And I think that immigrants in the U.S. today, they're not accepted with the same love and affection that I was as a child, and as a young adult living abroad.
Yeah. It's so shameful and so embarrassing because it really isn't the story we tell about our history or any of those things. It's not the long history that we've had in the US. It is sort of a more recent kind of rhetoric that's happening in a real shift. So I would love for you to speak about, I know that you're mostly involved with asylum cases, but the reality is there's not just one way to immigrate to the United States. In most countries that would be true. Like in Singapore, there were different kinds of visas for people who were maybe from Bangladesh building the MRT line, and there was like, if you have a master's degree and you're going into this kind of role, there's a different kind of visa that you come in on. There's spouse visas. And in the US, we have everything from the H-1B visas, which are pretty common here in Sunnyvale, where I live in the Texas
Hmm.
area. There's spouse visas, there's student visas. Of course, there's asylum seekers. There's a variety of ways to come in. And I know there's a lot of different policies. There's been some recent crackdown on the H-1B visa that's been in the news, and that's caused a lot of nervousness here in the Silicon Valley. And then I know, like, I have some Venezuelan or some Singaporean friends at Stanford that they were kind of on edge for a little while when there was some talk about people on student visas in the U.S. having to return to their countries, at the beginning of the fall semester.
Right.
So I would just love for you to speak about, just in general, like our current immigration policies and processes, and kind of what are your thoughts on that right now?
So presently, I believe that still we're not letting anyone into the country. Everything's on hold. That goes to asylum seekers and spouses of U.S. citizens. We're still shut down presently. Um, a lot of the consulates they're just starting to open up, so I think we're slowly starting to see a reopening. Um, but I think again, it goes to they're trying to limit. Um, I think just a big with all these visas. I think that we're restricting. Again, as you go back to H-1B, we're trying to limit. We're not allowing as many H-1B visa holders as we used to. So, in the whole background, the defense for that is U.S. jobs. Apparently, President Trump wants to add more U.S. jobs. So he used COVID again, the whole tragedy thing, to limit the H-1B workers coming from abroad in order to open up for more U.S. workers. I don't really
Yeah.
know if that's valid or not. If that'll really allow more U.S. workers to work or not.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the best example. Fortunately, President Trump tried to cut off so that one of the biggest ways to immigrate is family-based immigration. So basically, if you're a child, a spouse, or a parent, or a sibling of a U.S. citizen, or in some cases a permanent resident, you can come here on a green card. The administration tried really hard to change the law on that, but the good news is that statute, and so the president can't change a statute. So that unless Congress votes to change the law, that's going to stay in place. But what the president has done, again, it goes through the word restrictive. I think that's a theme that I've seen in the last several years. So even though spouses of U.S. citizens can come to the United States, so there's this new rule. It's called a public charge rule. Basically, you're inadmissible to the United States if you are going to be a public charge. That means if you're likely to go on public benefits like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. If it's likely that you're really poor, you don't have much of an education, that you're going to go on welfare or something similar, then you are not admissible to the United States. So and that's a rule that just came out, I believe, in November. And it's actually being fought in the courts. The courts keep on going back and forth whether that's legal or not legal. The Supreme Court hasn't made a final decision on it. So we keep going back and forth. Sometimes it's valid, sometimes it's not. It's hard to advise clients because the law keeps changing every month or two on that. So even though President Trump can't say spouses of U.S. citizens can't come, what he is trying to do is say what kind of, like, if you are going to be a public burden, then you're inadmissible because you're too poor and you cannot come to the United States. You don't qualify for a green card based upon your marriage to a U.S. citizen or the fact that your parents a parent of a U.S. citizen. So that's probably one of the biggest changes I've seen. I think the whole idea, and you can tell from the whole, you see the big picture when you see it's been 3.5 years of this current administration, and everything that they do is an attempt to limit. Ultimately, they're just trying to limit. In both this is what people don't realize is that he's limiting not just illegal immigrants, but he's also limiting legal immigration.
Right.
So this has no idea about upholding the rule of law, protecting our borders, nothing to do with that. I think it's more of a nationalistic position. We don't want foreigners, people who aren't Caucasian, into our country. And so I think that's such a theme with this current administration is limiting any kind of immigration, whether that's legal or illegal, in any way possible, whether that's using COVID as an excuse, whether that's using public charges and public benefits as an excuse, danger to the community. I mean, there's so many reasons why they say that why they do what they do. But at the end of the day, the only justification is simply to limit anyone from coming into the United States.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of conversation around legal versus illegal immigration. And, I'll hear some people say, well, I know so and so, and they waited in a camp in Africa for 10 years in a refugee camp, and they're finally, their lottery number was called and they were able to seek asylum. And so there can be some hard feelings toward those who came here illegally when they had to, go through that process themselves. And, there's also the thing that not only has legal immigration been so challenging in so many of these types of ways to come. But if we're increasing how hard it is, that it's probably increasing the illegal immigration because it's just people are that desperate to get here for the various reasons that they come. So, yeah, what are some of your thoughts on those kind of conversations?
Um, yeah, I do think that, I mean, at the end of the day, people are coming to the United States to make a better life for themselves and for their family. And so even though we might make it more difficult for them to get here, but that's, as we saw even with all the migrant caravans, during
Yeah,
President Trump, that's not going to stop them from trying to come here to make a better life for themselves. And I do agree that um, I mean, what you're doing when you tell a spouse of a U.S. citizen that they can't come into the country, then they're probably going to figure out some way to make it, whether it's through the legal process or not.
yeah,
Um, and so I don't, you know, yeah, I think it's tough because I also see, as an attorney, I see people desperate trying to come to the United States, and it's tough because people like caravans from Guatemala. I mean, I know what's going to happen. 99.5% of them are going to be turned around and sent back home. So they're
yeah,
going through thousands of miles. Who know how much money they save up to pay for the trip. Um,
yeah,
but they're not gonna make it. They're not gonna win their cases because most Central Americans don't win asylum cases. That's just the reality of it.
yeah,
Unless you're from Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba, those are the countries that we're seeing winning. But none of the other countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, those countries they don't win. Um,
yeah,
and so I agree with that, right? Because I see that these people are desperate because
yeah,
they truly are trying to run from something, or they're so poor that they can't support their families. But I see that as an attorney, I see the other side that I know what's going to happen when the case is over. The judge is going to
yeah.
deny it and he's going to deport them. And it's a tough one. So yeah, it's kind of I feel compassion, but I wish I could go live in Guatemala and maybe counsel some of these people before they make that decision, just so they make a more informed decision about their
Yeah.
life before they walk journey 7,000 miles to get here. Um,
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking because clearly what's going on in some of these places in El Salvador and Guatemala and southern Mexico and different places, like, my parents live on the border, so I hear stories through them. And a lot of the people
mhm.
are just small indigenous people. Some speak Spanish, some don't, some speak, just whatever, their native language is. I don't hear stories of these like murderers, thieves coming across like what we're being told.
Right.
That it's children, it's like people who are really shy and traumatized and exhausted, and desperate. And it is really sad, like you said, that they get turned away, that we don't offer them a chance for this American dream that we've all talked about for so long that doesn't seem attainable for those who are really needing it and suffering.
When you talk about children, that was such a good point. I got this call yesterday from this person who's detained. He's in removal. He came to the U.S. when he was so when you talked to him on the phone, he sounded like this Southerner. He has a really thick Southern accent. It sounds like he lives in a trailer somewhere in some rural area. He has that voice. But he came when he was 3 years old from Mexico,
Wow.
and he's Mexican, but he doesn't. I don't even know if he speaks Spanish, to be honest with you. He's fluent in English. He's American for all intents and purposes. He
Yeah.
feels American, but yet because he was brought here when he was a baby, a 3 year old, now he's being sent home. And so I think that one of the travesties of even before President Trump, this was an issue.
Yeah.
We had millions of DACA, millions of people who came here as kids,
Yeah.
and we're not giving them a way who are, went to public schools in the U.S. They were on our high school football teams, soccer teams, whatever,
Yeah.
baseball. They, are on, honor society, and yet, there's no pathway for them to become U.S. citizens. And I think out of all the things that makes me really sad, the fact that we haven't Congress hasn't come together and just made it a way for them to come here. That's it's a tragedy.
It is. I know we have so many of those DACA cases here in California, and I have some friends that work with some DACA cases trying to help people out. And I hear those kind of stories all the time. It breaks my heart because, my parents, your parents, they took us overseas and we were never asked, that was something that they did. Fortunately, they were
Right.
able to do that legally in the places they went. But if it had been a different situation for me and my parents had been somewhere illegally and raised me that way, and I was, doing what we see a lot of immigrants here in the Bay Area that work really hard. It's exactly what you're saying. They know they have to work twice and three times as hard as everyone else to make it. And I think that's pretty typical of the stories of immigrants that I know about, because they came here because they weren't just sitting around lazy accepting life as it was. They wanted to be proactive with their family, take a great risk, and raise their family somewhere else. And going a place where you're not known, you have no connections, you probably don't know the language, you don't have resources, you don't have anybody who can like put in a good word for you for a job anywhere. Like, you're just starting cold turkey with your family, and it takes a certain to do that. And they raise their kids typically to be very proactive and hardworking and try to get the best grades and try to do their best in sports or whatever they're involved in. I think that's a pretty typical story, and it's heartbreaking when those kids
Right.
get sent home to a place they've never known.
Absolutely. And even worse
Yeah.
when those kids don't know their own native language from their parents'
Yeah.
country, and they don't know, they
Yeah.
can't assimilate because that culture is completely foreign to them. Um, that's even harder. Um,
It is harder. So I'd love for you to talk about, most of us listening aren't immigration lawyers, but what are some practical ways that you think we can help immigrants in the U.S. and even around the world from your perspective?
I think two ways. Most immigrants, like one that I've even do as a non-attorney, I think that this is the most practical thing that we could probably do is, there's still a lot of these immigrants come here and they don't know much about the culture. They don't have the skill sets to, most of them want to assimilate. They want to learn English. They want to learn how we do things so they can live in society. So I think volunteering is something as simple as volunteering at your church or whatever local organizations you're close to, like teaching English or, I teach English, so I've been teaching English since I was like 17 years old. I still do that. I'm 41 now, so I've been doing it for, I don't even know, 24 years, but I still love to do it. And that's still something I can also provide to people who aren't my clients. And so, finding a nonprofit organization or a church and just, volunteering and using your skills and teaching them skills that they don't have that we do have, like something as simple as speaking English. I think that on a bigger level, advocating, I think, is a big issue. DACA is probably number one. If I'd asked for people to put number one, something on their priority list, I think DACA would be it. If there's anything that we need to make a priority in the next 4 to 5 years, it needs to be DACA, finding a way for those millions of people in DACA. And I think that's advocating, that's whether that's attending rallies, that's, getting the word out about how DACA kids do contribute to our country, and just allowing people, giving them more information to make, so that Congress can act on that. But again, I think most practical when it comes to community-wide, just find a local organization that invests in immigrants and ask what you can do to help them. There's so many across the country. And if you don't have one, if you live in a rural area like I do, then start one. I mean, I mean, our church that I go to, we have English classes for our adults from like 3 to 5. But I told my pastor, listen, you're missing out a large group because a lot of these men that work and women, they don't finish work until the sun sets. And so maybe we need to start classes from 7 to 9 instead of 3 to 5. So go out and be proactive and start something. There's, again, a lot of immigrants that are here don't have the tools, the skill sets to function, to completely assimilate. And most of them do want those tools. And so they are looking for help to figure out how to live life in the US. And there's so much we can do when it comes to that.
Those are all such good ideas and seem very doable for most of us. I think it's important just for us to, find the big and small ways that we can all help out for those of us who aren't dealing with, immigration and visa issues wherever we live. But it does lead us to the conversation, and this may be a bit of a more challenging question, but there's a lot of conversation in the U.S. right now, at least in the area of racism, where we talk about the individual responsibility, like an individual who might, for example, be racist versus a system of racism. And so, like, I know that individuals with, as immigration issues in America have their own individual situation, but then there's also some systemic things that make it really difficult, and as for a whole group of people to ever make it in this whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of concept that we have, that it is hard when the system is really stacked against you as an immigrant. So what are some of the systemic ways we could be involved, especially for those of us who have privilege to do so, to help change some of the system? What would you say were some steps we could take?
That's way above my pay grade. Um, that's a great question. You probably have some better ideas than I would about that. You give me your thoughts, and I'll give you my responses to that. So, what's one idea that you have on that, Lori, that you think
Well,
about systemic change?
I think that, and this is a controversial thing too, but I think voting is a really big one.
Hmm.
Some people don't take into consideration immigration when they're voting. Some people
Right.
have one issue in mind and only one issue, um, about how lives matter. But even calling senators and pushing our mayors. I mean, we live in like a sanctuary city, but not everywhere is like that. Um, I my friend Alan Cross, I interviewed him recently, and he talked about he knew the sheriff in Montgomery, and when he saw people being racially profiled and pulled over, he talked to the sheriff, and the sheriff talked to the police about not doing that. I mean,
Right.
those kinds of things. And I don't
That's a
know in
great example.
Louisiana. Yeah, I don't know
So
what it's like in Louisiana, but
that's a big thing. So I've noticed a lot of my detained clients. So this is kind of immigration side of it. Um, so police officers are not really supposed to act as ICE officers. So that basically
uh-huh.
that means like if you can pull someone over for a ticket, but a police officer isn't really supposed to inquire about their immigration status. And so I had one client. He was literally walking on the side of a highway, and a police officer drove up to him and arrested him for I don't even know what. He didn't even have a valid reason to arrest him other than the fact that he wasn't legal. And the judge actually was real. This is one of those few good judges that you get, few good immigration judges. She gave him
Yeah,
the lowest bond possible because she knew what the police officer did was as illegal as you get. You know, and she said, "Don't." She made a joke like, "Don't go walking the highways anymore" or something. I've seen immigrants, pulled over by police for a broken taillight and then arrested. And so I think
yeah,
that when it comes to systemic racism, I do see a lot of examples of local, you know, police officers all across. And I've seen it in Chicago, like the taillight incident was in Illinois. So it's not just Louisiana that you see, or that you see that. It's all
yeah,
over the country. And so I think that
yeah,
there's such an animosity towards immigrants that police, um, a lot of times you will see the police make an illegal arrest. The problem though is that as illegal as it was, that's not 99% of the immigration judges aren't going to care about how they got detained by ICE. The only thing they're going to care about is whether they're illegally in the country, legally in the country, or illegally in the country. So
yeah,
you can't even bring that issue up in immigration court. So I have seen a lot of, police are allowed. For example, if someone actually commits a real crime like arson or burglary, then sure, at that point the police can arrest them. They can run a background check and then report them to ICE and transfer them to ICE custody. That's perfectly legal. But the situations where I've seen that aren't legal is where they arrest someone for not committing an arrestable offense, like broken taillight or a speeding ticket or, an expired, plate. I see over and over again illegal immigrants are arrested, actually put in handcuffs when the actions of the police officers in doing that are 100% illegal. They have no jurisdiction to make arrests like that. And the only reason is because they racially profiled them. They asked for their, I see U.S. citizens who are racially profiled. They look like an immigrant. They look illegal. And
Yeah.
the police ask for identification. I see that over and over again. So I think that when it comes to immigrants, I think the systemic part is probably a big part of it is like as Alan was telling you, is the racial profiling, and a lot of that is done by the local police forces. And I think too that just for the people who aren't police, just a general like in my town, like I live in, it's 100% Republican. I don't know the percent of Democratic voters here. It's not very many. And so there's a significant distrust of immigrants in this town. I think that there's no desire to understand their stories. There's no desire to allow them to assimilate into our own culture. And so I think even though immigrants do want, what you see as a result, when we forcibly make the decision, whether it's, consciously or, subconsciously, we make the decision not to allow them into our lives because we have, preconceived ideas about who they are as people. That also plays into the systemic problem that immigrants face. And that often is getting jobs, is getting work, it's being employed. It's really tough to make a good life for yourself when you live in, rural America, red America. When you don't live in a big city, that's even more difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I have a good friend here from Nigeria, and she's a wonderful Christian woman, a single mom who fled from a really difficult situation. And it's not even in the Bay Area. Sometimes, like, she experiences some pretty racist things, but she's worked so hard to get here, and she's smart, and she's working on her job skills, and even here, it can be stacked against someone like that. It can be really difficult. Her case is still pending.
Mm-hmm.
But think probably a lot of people look at her and just think, her family's been here for generations, but they haven't. She's the first, and just a lot of stereotypes that we can have about people aren't helpful. And I just think it's a good reminder we all have work to do personally and systemically, and that there are steps, like you mentioned, that we can take in small and big ways to help make our society more open and welcoming, not just for them, but for us, because they add to our lives too. And we have so much to learn. I feel like I've learned a ton from the immigrants I've met that are just so hardworking and courageous, and they're inspiring to me, and they make me want to be more hardworking and courageous too, because that kind of thing is contagious. And I think they have a lot to teach us.
I would say when it comes to fighting that, everyone has an amazing story to tell. And we as humans, in order to fight against our own prejudices, we should be open to hearing their story. I think so few Americans, I think when I was 18, I think the hardest part about coming to America, I had all these experiences abroad, and none of the people I went to college with, very few of them cared about what my story was. They didn't ask me questions, probing questions. They didn't try to find out more about what makes me who I am. I had a story to tell, but no one wanted to hear it. And so I think so many immigrants have a story to tell, whether it's someone, the doctor from Syria, or whether it's someone from Venezuela who, is fleeing the regime there. All these immigrants have such an incredible story to tell. And so for anyone listening to this, listen to their stories and just spend time being a listener, understanding where they come from. And that'll give us more compassion for, where they're at now.
That's so good. Would you leave us with maybe a story that's one of the ones that impacted you the most?
So I think the biggest one,
from any of your clients?
Probably the one from Syria. I think just bringing it current today. So that was the Syrian client was a while ago. So obviously my faith is really important to me. We often talk about, the persecuted church. We see how life is difficult for so many Christians abroad. I think that's something, again, this church in America doesn't truly grasp. We don't realize the freedoms we have in this country to worship. And so I have a current client. He's still detained. His case isn't over, but he's a Christian. He's Pentecostal, and he lives in Eritrea. Most people, Eritrea is a tiny, tiny sliver of a country near Somalia in northeastern portion of Africa. And that country is, it's very communist. It's extreme in its ideology. It only allows like state-sponsored, religion, and it's against the law to be, Pentecostal. So basically, my client, who's been detained for a year, despite the fact that he suffered so much suffering abroad. So he was shared Jesus with his students. He was a teacher, and he got arrested he was put in prison for 2 months. He was released. He fled the country, went to Sudan, lived in Sudan for several years before finally coming to the U.S. And so I think that as a believer, as someone who follows Christ, the persecuted church they're scattered through all of our detention centers in America. They're not released. And especially when we call ourselves a Christian nation, to see other believers treated that way. And it goes for any religion. People are going to have a similar story. So that's currently probably a story that kind of moves me. And so I was in court one day and he approached me and says, I need your help. Could you listen to me? So I sat down with him for 30 minutes and just listened to his story. And so for me, one of the big things I try to do, I definitely have to make a living for my work. So a lot of people pay me, but I try really hard to be always open to providing pro bono services for those who can afford me, because I don't ever want to turn someone away because of money. And so that, like this person, he's not paying me anything. And so that's just one way I can help. But his final hearing is in about 2 weeks. So if you ever have another podcast, I could give you an update. He has a great case, but these judges, immigration judges, they're so bad that it's really hard to win. So we'll see. Keeping my fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, hopefully all of us listening can say a prayer for him and God will work in his favor and give him what he really needs to make it here. That would be wonderful if that happened. But I do thank you for sharing that story, because I think you're so right. I think each individual has a story. When I came to college, I felt all the same ways you did. When I was leaving Venezuela and coming here, I didn't feel like people understood so much of my story. And then when I've met immigrants and heard their stories, I just thought even more so. I mean, they've been through such hard things. If, persecution, if you're fleeing a situation where your faith is not allowed to be practiced in the way that you feel convicted about, or people who've come across oceans and dangerous situations, people who've survived war, people who've survived unspeakable things. If there's anything that we learned living in Indonesia after the tsunami and the trauma that people experience, it's that just telling your story is therapeutic, because as human beings, we just need someone to listen. Mm-hmm. But I learned so much, even in those stories of survival and the tsunami, and just the way God saved people, just literally saved people. And I think that immigrants are full of stories of miracles of God saving their lives and bringing them here. And they're just such a gift to us. Even to hear their story is such a sacred space. So thank you for encouraging us to do that, because I think it's one just really small but big thing that each of us could do, is reach out and just hear someone's story, and we can all benefit from that. Well, thank you for your time today. I know you're really busy, so I really appreciate it. And I know that you're doing really great work. So just God bless you and all the cases that you have currently and the ones that you will get in the future. Thank you for just living out your faith in a very practical way of living out biblical justice, social justice, right where you are and where God's put you. I just really
absolutely. And let me just say one last thing before we go off. One of the ways I'm able to help people, I always tell people, I'll talk to anyone for free. Tell me your story, call me and let me know. And as an attorney, so if anyone's listening to this, an immigrant who needs help, they just can't afford it. If they want someone to give them a blueprint for how to proceed and have legal status, always, contact Lori. And I talk to people all the time on the phone across the country. I work with them and I try to help them navigate through their situation to figure out what's the best way for them to live here permanently. So anyone that's listening that knows anyone that needs help, absolutely reach out, and I'll do everything I can to help you guys. And that's a part of who I am as a person, and no obligation. You don't have to pay me for anything other than just giving you time for however long we need to figure things out. So anyways.
That's really kind of you. You're definitely a Kinnison.
Well, thank you, Laura. I enjoyed this. I enjoy this.
Yes. I
So,
did
all
too.
right.
Thank
Absolutely.
you so much.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, we'll talk to you
All right.
again
Sounds
soon,
good. Bye bye.
hopefully. Bye, Chris. Well, this was certainly just so enlightening to hear just firsthand stories from an immigration lawyer here in the United States, who has been in the courtroom with countless immigrants, hearing their stories, just pouring his heart and soul into just defending them and trying to help them. And I just, that moment where he said it's like 99.5% of those coming in from Guatemala and Central America and all these areas are in these caravans are going to be turned back. And, thinking of the spouses who are trying to make it here to be with their spouses, and knowing how hard it is, how difficult it is, how desperate people are. And I know that you, along with me, just heard Chris's heart. He has certainly been very diligent to study and continually study to prepare for each of his clients and defend them in court. And yet, at the same time, he puts a lot of heart and soul into what he does, and just that super generous offer that he put out there at the end, that if we know anyone who needs legal representation, that he's willing to help people. And wow, it's just so many immigration lawyers out there I know are like Chris, where they go into this to help people and do it with such hard work. And even when some of the laws are just very, very difficult to navigate, especially now, and in some ways more so than they ever have been in particular ways. And so, yeah, I just hope that the things that he taught us about today, that those will spur on conversations that you'll have with people in your lives, with your families, with your spouses, with those in your community, with immigrants that with maybe some immigration lawyers, and this has been a real eye-opener of knowing how to pray for them. And they really are just on the front lines helping people. And it really is just, it's so good to know what goes into that, what Chris is dealing with on a daily basis and how to advocate for people. But it's also, maybe you're listening to this and this has been a moment where you just felt really compelled that this is an area you want to study to be an immigration lawyer yourself. And this has just been that moment where you realize, I want to do what Chris does. I want to help people in the way that he does. I don't really know what information you're taking away from this today, but I know that all of us can take away something. We have something to learn. So I just encourage you to think through what that one next step is for you, what one piece of information that is a mindset shift for you today, or opened your eyes in some way, maybe opened your heart in a different way. And I just think that as we listen to this story, Chris has really put it out there to help us see immigrants in a different light. As a child, he had this opportunity to see people coming into Thailand from Cambodia that were desperate and that were so desperate that they'd be willing to come into a situation in Thailand that was also not ideal. But as we've heard time and again throughout this series, people leave one country for another as an immigrant or as a refugee, mostly because life isn't sustainable for whatever reason where they are. And there's a variety of reasons. So it's so important to just hear the stories. And I know as a lawyer, he hears the stories in such a way as to take notes and to pay attention to every single detail, because he has to stand before a judge and a jury and defend people. And so he has to have good listening skills. So I just encourage you to have the kind of listening skills with immigrants around you that Chris Kinnison undoubtedly does. That we just hear the words and then we listen for the feelings behind it. It's just certainly true that our Creator God made our bodies to have emotions. And when we have experiences as immigrants, there's no way there aren't a lot of feelings and emotions tied into that. And to just shut those down and move on when you get to the new nation, it's not helpful for anyone. Those feelings, especially the traumatic ones, they catch up with us. So maybe just listening today, that's the one step you can take away, is just to find an immigrant near you. And whether their English is broken or fluent, just be a listener and listen for the feelings. And if you don't even understand a lot of the words they're saying, you can listen for the feelings and just be that friend, that listening ear that so many of our immigrant friends around us need to hear. So I just hope that this has been as enlightening for you today as it was for me. Thank you so much to Chris Kinnison for giving us his time today and for all that he does every day on behalf of immigrants here in the United States, and just his years of experience around the world working with IDPs and other refugees where he's lived. I just pray and hope that today you take away something really special, and it allows you to do something new and different in your life to bring change and make a difference in the lives of someone near you who really needs that friend. Tune in next week because we are going to get to hear from my friend here in the Bay Area, Gracia Berrios, and she herself is an immigrant. She came here as a baby from Peru in South America, and she currently works here in the Bay Area with a lot of our DACA cases. So she has a lot of firsthand information as well on a lot of the immigrant situations here in California. And she's just a really dedicated and special person here in the Bay Area with the work that she does. So tune in for that, and I hope you guys have a great week. Bye. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.